Hello and welcome to Format 360. I'm Elizabeth Jenkins. Tonight we're talking about the path to renewable energy in Southeast Alaska. I'm joined by three guests to discuss advances in technology and the challenges of powering some of the region's most remote locations. My guests are Jody Mitchell, the CEO of Inside Passage Electric Cooperative, Jim Rayfeld, an engineer with Alaska's Energy Engineering, and also Bill Lady, the director of the Lady Foundation. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Thank you.
And so, Jody, I want to start with you. So, you're the CEO of the Inside Electric Cooperative, and you help power some of Southeast's most remote locations. What's the history behind bringing electricity to the villages?
Well, Inside Passage Electric Cooperative was formerly known as Clinton-Haida Regional Electrical Authority, and where we call it THREA. Well, THREA was created to assist with providing central station service to these small communities. Many of them had been municipal-run utilities before that, and they were receiving HUD assistance through the Clinton-Haida Housing Authority, and they needed a vehicle to be able to match the new housing communities with electricity. So Clinton-Haida Electrical Authority was formed in order to we could borrow money and provide the infrastructure necessary to electrify these new housing subdivisions in the small communities. And so THREA began operations in 1977 and operated as a political subdivision of the state until the end of 2003. And then we reorganized as a nonprofit, tax-exempt, member-owned electric cooperative in 2004.
And Inside Passage Electric Cooperative supplies energy to a lot of places: Angoon, Klukwan, Cake, the Chilkat Valley, and Hoonah. What are some of the biggest barriers to bringing renewable energy to those places?
Cost.
Yeah.
Costs are high and electric loads are very small. IPEC only has about 1,350 customers right now over the 5 communities combined. So that leads to very low economies of scale in any kind of an environment. And we basically have 5 separate power plants to serve those communities. We have 2 hydro projects and all the rest are diesel. And the other thing about these small communities is that their loads are very, very small. In fact, our average monthly residential consumption for 2015 was only 338 kilowatt hours per month. My home here in Juneau, I have kids and they're not very conservative, but we probably burn at least 1,000 kilowatt hours per month.
Especially in the winter when our lights are on and it's a darker time of year.
Yeah, and we don't even have electric heat.
Yeah.
So it's amazing. I don't know how they do it, but somehow they're able to conserve in order to keep their consumption down. The rate per kilowatt hour was 57 cents per residential kilowatt hour in 2015. So that's pretty high. I mean, here in Juneau we pay about 12 cents. So that's extremely high. Part of that was paid for by the Power Cost Equalization program, but even then, their rate is in the low 20s after PCE.
And that's Power Cost Equalization, right?
Yes.
PCE.
Yeah, I know you want to talk about that a little bit too.
Oh yeah.
But when diesel prices were at $4.25 a gallon, our rates were in the 68 cent range. So because we're diesel dependent, our rates fluctuate with the price of diesel. And right now we're only paying around, only paying around $2.10 a gallon.
Yeah.
And we were paying as low as $1.50 or so earlier this year, but they seem to be going back up a little bit now.
And for someone who might not know, why is it difficult to build new hydro projects in these spots?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is finding a project that is close by.
Yeah.
And that is right-sized. If you think about it, you have to go with pretty much what God gave us. And the Hoonah Project was perfect because there was already a road. We've been talking about the Gartina Falls project that we brought online last year. It was perfect because there was, like I said, you could drive to it already. We had to build a 4.5 mile transmission line, but transmission lines are very expensive. They can cost, I think it's about maybe $300,000 or $400,000 a mile for transmission line. And furthermore, there was a natural fall there, and so there was an anadromous barrier. But even so, we had to get a FERC permit for that project, which not only
takes time, right?
Oh man,
Yeah.
yes, it's a big delay, and it's a huge expense up front that really you don't get any benefit from. And it was just really disappointing that we had to permit that by FERC. I can't tell you how. I mean, it probably added at least $1.5 million to the cost of the project. So anyway, finding the right size project is very important. And the Hoonah Project, is you went with us out there last year when we had the
There's a big
the grand
celebration.
opening. Yeah. Oh yeah. It was a big deal. And even though that project is so perfect, we wish it was bigger, because it only provides about 1/3 of the power for the community, and the rest of it's diesel.
And I know the Renewable Energy Fund, there was nothing in there this past year. How has the state's budget crunch impacted some of these projects?
Well, unfortunately, without grant money, it's really hard to make these projects pencil. And I mean by even just getting them to break even would be great. But because our rates are high already, the projects that we want to bring online, we want to reduce costs. We don't want to increase costs, especially when you have rates that are as high as ours are already. I would be in a lot of trouble if I built a project that increased rates from what they are already. But unfortunately, that's the price of renewables. Renewables are often much more expensive than the alternative. Of course, we don't want to be polluting, but electricity is a pretty essential commodity for anybody in today's world. So. Anyway, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And just talking about some of the expense, PCEs that we're talking about, that's power cost equalization, that helps make those rates, electricity rates for people in rural places, more affordable.
Yes.
But we're talking about our state budget crunch. There have been concerns about that program going away. How will that affect some of those communities?
If it did, it would be an absolute disaster. The people in these small communities, many of them live a subsistence lifestyle. The biggest bill they pay is probably their electric bill every month, besides maybe their food bill or whatever. But their electric bill is really hard for them to cover as it is. So without power cost equalization, I would hate to even think about what would happen, and I just hope that doesn't happen. It seems like the legislature tried really hard to protect it last year, and I hope that continues.
And what's next for Inside Passage Electric Cooperative? I remember the other day we were talking about a project in Cake that you've been working on.
Yes, I'm very excited about the project in Cake. We've found there's a dam, actually an existing dam over there in Cake, that we're going to develop, and we hope to be doing this next year. In fact, we're pushing forward to do it next year, unless for some reason somebody stops us. And somehow with these kind of projects, it seems like someone always does want to stop you, unfortunately. But we are moving forward. It'll be similar in size to the one in Hoonah, about 500 kW. But because Cake is a smaller community, it will provide about half of the power for the community. It's a longer penstock. It's about 2,100 feet of penstock, and it's we expect it'll be a really good project for Cake. So we're working on getting the financing ready now.
And the remaining funding that you need, would that be typically something that came from the Renewable Energy Fund in the past?
Yes, and we applied. It was so disheartening because we did apply, and in any normal year we would have gotten funding because we were recommended for funding, but the problem was there was no money. So I remember, I saw Governor Walker a couple times, and he probably thinks I'm the crazy lady because every time I'd see him, I'd say, "Please don't cut the Renewable Energy Fund, please, Governor." And he, I don't think he knew my name, but I'm sure he remembered me because I kept doing that every time I'd see him. And but he had no choice, and I understand. But that program really helped a lot of projects move forward. It provided $8 million of funding for the Hoonah Project, which made it pencil, made it so that it provided net benefits to the community. So it was really the only place that we could go to get funding. The federal programs, they're very competitive. There's the High Energy Cost Grant Program, that's a federal program, but you know, you're competing with people all over the nation for that money, and and the other thing that's really frustrating is that the federal government does not consider hydro a renewable resource, if you can believe that. It's, you know, but maybe it's because of where we live, you know, here in Southeast Alaska with all the rain. It's hard to believe that that's not renewable, right? But in the federal government, it's not. Senator Murkowski is working to try to change that through her energy bill, and I hope and pray that that passes, but it's looking less and less likely because of, you know, they're running out of time. And my understanding is they have to start over with a new Congress, so.
Well, thanks for answering my questions, Jody. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to look at a video about district heating. It's an energy efficient system that heats homes and businesses in Scandinavian countries, and now a company wants to bring that technology to Juneau.
How do you achieve a sustainable, low-carbon city? With a district energy system. And the United Nations agrees. That's why we partnered with them, ICLEI, and others on the District Energy in Cities initiative. Why district energy? District energy systems include highly insulated underground thermal piping networks that transmit steam, hot water, and chilled water from a central plant or plants to heat and cool multiple buildings in a city, community, or campus. Because thermal energy is delivered directly to the building in usable form, customers avoid installing expensive equipment like boilers, chillers, and cooling towers that take up valuable space and incur costs for operations, maintenance, repair, and replacement. District Energy Service simplifies building operations, allowing customers precise control over heating and cooling, taking only what's needed, and provides valuable flexibility to easily adapt as occupant needs change or building efficiency improves. Here's the critical advantage. When a district energy network interconnects multiple buildings, it aggregates diverse heating and cooling profiles, achieving economies of scale that enable deployment of more efficient, resilient local energy resources. This scale enables integration of cleaner options, significantly cutting carbon emissions unachievable on a building-by-building basis. Options like combined heat and power, waste to energy, biomass, geothermal, and other renewables like lake or ocean cooling become economically feasible. Want to move your city forward, but unsure how to start? Visit the UNEP District Energy in Cities initiative today and accelerate your city's path to a low-carbon future.
And Jim, I'd like to move on to you. Juneau's electricity comes from renewable hydropower, from a privately owned electric utility. Still, when it comes to heating homes, most people do this with heating fuel, which can be expensive and doesn't burn clean. Now another company has received their federal license, that's known as the FERC license, to build a new hydro facility, and they want to use that to power a seawater heat pump system in downtown Juneau. So there's some people sitting out there who might not be familiar with that technology. What is that?
Sure, I guess we'll start with a district heating system, which is basically a central heating plant, and then it's connected by pipelines to buildings. Now, if you look at our existing buildings, they're mostly heated with fuel oil boilers. And what the boiler does is it heats water, and the water is then pumped around the building to the heating units, and the heating units extract the heat out of the water, move it into the building. Water comes back to the boiler a little colder, and the boiler heats it back up. With the district heating system, the boilers would basically go away, and now the central heating plant would take the place of all of those boilers. It would heat the water up to a warmer temperature, we'd supply it out to the buildings, and it comes back when the building's cold, and we warm it back up again. What differs from what we have now is what we're going to use is a seawater heat pump, and that heat pump will extract heat from gas in no channel to heat the buildings. Now, it may be counterintuitive to most people, but it uses a refrigeration technology that's very similar to the refrigerator in your house. Just as the refrigerator takes the heat out of the cold interior of the refrigerator and transfers it to the warmer room, the heat pump can take the heat out of gas no channel, lift it up into higher temperature, and send it out to the buildings and heat the buildings.
And so the whole idea is that could displace heating fuel in the community, right?
Right, it can displace mostly heating fuel. That's how most of our buildings are heated, but some of them are also heated with electricity. And the way the heat pump can do that is two things. First, it's going to use renewable hydroelectric power from the Sweetheart Lake project. And that will power the heat pump, and then the heat pump will then, through its refrigeration cycle, extract heat from gas in no channel. And it does that at an efficiency of about 300%. So every unit of electricity from Sweetheart Lake becomes 3 units of heat to the buildings. Where when you buy fuel oil, your boiler actually has losses, and so you only get about 75% of the heating content of the fuel that actually ends up as heat in your house. So the heat pump ultimately delivers heat as a lower cost than fuel oil heat.
And I know you recently took a trip to Denmark and Norway to see some district heating systems there. What was that like?
Oh, it was very interesting. We went to both district heating systems in Denmark, and then we went to a seawater heat pump district heating system in Norway. And in Denmark, it's become commonplace. It's part of their national goal is to heat with district heating. So it was very interesting to go to these different plants and operations and see how just normal this is and how they are heating buildings at a lower price using district heating than they are with the other alternatives that people have.
And so what's the difference between Norway and Denmark with their district heating systems?
Well, in Denmark, district heating was a national goal, and it came about with the oil embargo in the 1970s and how it shut down their country because so much of their energy came from fossil fuels. So they passed a legislation saying that our electric grid now has to become more efficient by being combined heat and power plants, which means in addition to producing electricity, they're now producing heat. And the district heating was the mechanism for distributing that heat out to the buildings, and they were able to do it at a much lower cost. In Norway, really district heating came about mostly because they found local areas where district heating is cost effective. The business model works for district heating, and they're able to use different technologies and different energy sources to deliver heat to buildings at a lower cost than the other alternatives that people have.
And what's the history behind district heating coming to those places?
Well, it's mostly driven by, like I said, in Denmark, they had a national goal to do this. And it's promoted and grown to the point where 50% of the heating load is now heated with district heating. And in densely populated areas like Copenhagen, 98% of the residences are heated with district heat. And in Norway, they look for opportunities where they can make it work. One of the plants we looked at in Norway to show how local it is they're actually using a heat pump to extract heat from their wastewater. and they're able to heat 11,000 buildings with the heat that is lost in the wastewater.
That sounds like a pretty innovative system.
It really is.
And it said it could cost several $1 million here. Juno Hydropower says it has private investors and it's looking into loans and bonding options. How did these countries fund this?
Yeah, in Denmark it was funded through the utilities because they had heat to sell, and the revenues from selling the heat helped to pay for the infrastructure to build the system and to operate the system. And it's the same in Norway. It's the utilities are funding these as different options and better options than the existing options they have for heating their buildings.
So is the funding plan realistic given our budget crisis we're going through right now?
For the Juneau district heating system really doesn't depend on the state budget crisis at all. What the factors that make the most are most important to the viability of the system is, can we deliver the heat to the buildings at a lower cost than the other options, and can we get enough customers to sign up that we can generate the revenues to pay for the system?
And it's my understanding for it to work here, it'd have to be like some type of subscription system. So you'd have like the Juneau Douglas High School come online first, perhaps like the state building, and then homes. It kind of fans out from there, right?
Right. And what happens in Denmark, which is the same model that we will use, first, there's commercial customers, like the state buildings and the city buildings and the schools and the swimming pool that obviously are high loads, and they're, it's really, they can pay for the infrastructure up front to get the distribution system in place. But like in Norway or in Denmark, they're not allowed to expand district heating into an area unless that expansion can pay for itself. And it will be the same thing when we start looking at residential areas. We will need a dense grouping of buildings, so the pipeline costs are smaller, and then we'll need a high subscription rate. We'll need, in Denmark, that's typically 70% of the houses have to sign up before they know they can go into an area and expand into it. We don't know what those numbers are here, but it would be the same criteria as far as how far we expand this system.
And seawater heat pumps have been done on a small scale already here in Alaska, right?
Correct.
I'm thinking of the Ted Stevens Marine Research Lab.
Correct. Yeah, I was lucky enough to be involved in that project, and here again, like they did in Norway with the wastewater system, Ted Stevens took advantage, or the research center took advantage of a resource they already had, which was seawater. They were already pumping it through the building for their research, and as it's leaving the building, it's warm. It's got energy in it, and so we connected the heat pump up to that, and converted some other things in the building, and just like that, we're heating the building mostly with the heat from water that was just being dumped back into Lynn Canal.
So that's a small-scale project, and that's an example of something that's going to be happening potentially down the line here in a larger scale, right?
Correct, correct.
And so we have a video to watch. This is another small-scale seawater heat pump, and this comes to us from Alaska's Energy Desk, and this is a seawater heat pump in Seward.
The Sea Life Center in Seward is perched above the chilly waters of Resurrection Bay. The resident fish, seals, and octopus thrive in the cold water from the bay. And now, the aquarium's visitors are relying on that same water for heat.
The basis of this whole heat pump system is Resurrection Bay. That's the source of ocean heat that we're using. It's about 52 degrees.
That's Andy Baker. His Anchorage-based company, Your Clean Energy, designed the heat pumps at the aquarium.
Most people would say 52 degrees doesn't seem very hot.
While it feels cold, especially if you swam in there, for a heat pump, they like to see source temperatures of 35 degrees or warmer.
Baker encourages me to think of the bay as a giant solar battery, storing energy generated 4,000 miles away.
We're allowing the sun to heat the ocean at the equator. The natural gyres are moving that heat up to Alaska. So heat is coming to Seward, all that direction, free of charge. And the bay is the storage facility.
Not only does the center use this natural source of energy to heat its entire building, but it treats the heat pump as a demonstration project, another way to share scientific knowledge with the wider Alaskan community.
So we're going to do a tour today through the heating plant of the Sea Life Center, which is basically borrowing heat from the ocean. A really good analogy is your refrigerator at home. If you came home with a six-pack of warm beer, and you put it in your refrigerator.
The refrigerator sucks the warmth from that beer, with the help of a chemical refrigerant, into a pump and turns it into vapor.
And then that heat from that hot vapor is rejected out into your kitchen floor. That's why there's warm air coming out of the bottom of your refrigerator. That warm air is the heat that was extracted from the beer. We're just simply taking the heat out of the ocean and rejecting it at a higher temperature into the building.
Baker says heat pumps are a lot more efficient than traditional heating sources.
It's not a free lunch, and we have to put electrical energy into the heat pumps, but the fact is that we put in 1 unit of energy into driving these pumps, and we get 2 to 3 units of energy out. So we're running between 200% and 300% efficiency. That's a lot better than an 85% oil boiler or a 100% electric boiler.
Those efficiency gains, plus not having to purchase and store heating oil, have saved the center a lot of money. The over $1.4 million cost of the system was covered largely by grants. Despite high upfront costs, Baker says this type of heat system has a lot of potential in coastal communities in Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. In Seward, for Alaska's Energy Desk, I'm Eric Ketto.
And Bill, I'd like to move on to you. The Lady Foundation has made it a mission to look at ways to conserve energy. It also helps contribute to KTOO's internship program. So can you tell me more about your foundation's involvement in energy and climate change issues?
We're a typical small charitable family foundation. I'm one of the 7 directors, and my wife Nancy Waterman and I are 2 of the 7. So we're more interested in all aspects of how we humans are going to transform the world's largest industry from about 85% fossil to about 100% non-CO2 emitting renewable energy sources as quickly as we prudently and profitably can. So conservation is part of that, efficiency is part, and then sourcing our energy from these CO2 emissions-free sources is a very important part too. But all 3 of them have to be put together in an engineered system. Jim and I are both engineers. He's more competent than I am. But there has to be a systems integration from photons and moving air and water molecules all the way to energy services. After all, nobody wants to buy a kilowatt hour or a liter of fuel. We want the services they provide. So we have to keep that in mind. And whenever we talk about energy, not just electricity, that's only about 1/3 of our energy supply. We have to consider transportation energy and other forms of energy that we think are important and essential too.
I think in our conversation, Jody and I touched on this a little bit. What do you think are some possible solutions to meeting the region's energy needs while investing in renewable energy?
If we knew that, the Renewable Energy Seed Cluster Industry Working Group under JEDC, funded by the Forest Service, would be a lot more successful than we have been so far. Jody knows that these are stranded communities and stranded resources, and the only way to put them together was some sort of transmission. How do you get the energy from a beautiful hydro site like Sweetheart Lake, for example? You got to build a cable and hope there's another cable you can connect to. They're stranded resources, and it's so expensive for a low load, a small load, to get that energy moved around. But Black and Veatch, when it did the first integrated resource plan for Southeast Alaska, said, Southeast Intertie, forget it. Even if somebody built that for you for free, the amount of energy that you would send over that grid to small communities like Hoonah is so small that you couldn't afford to maintain it. If a tree falls across a power line, it'll cost you more than you'll ever recoup in selling energy. So it's that stranded nature that's so difficult. Now, our U.S. Department of Energy has seized upon the idea that maybe we could use some of that stranded renewable electricity to make a fuel that we could move around affordably. We can move it around as hydrogen or anhydrous ammonia, NH3, which is a liquid that's very widely used. If we could make that work in Southeast Alaska, at that stranded hydro site, we could make liquid ammonia, ship it to Hoonah, offload it into big steel propane tanks essentially, and then they could use that as fuel. It runs the direct ammonia fuel cell, make your electricity, byproduct heat to heat the community, but we're not there yet. This is an R&D project that Department of Energy is funding, and our small company, Alaska Applied Sciences, Inc., has partnered with 2 national labs and 3 companies in the University of Minnesota for a proposal to try to come up with a way of synthesizing ammonia from renewable source electricity.
That's interesting. And so I want to talk a little bit about what some other places are doing. Next week, we'll know whether or not Washington State's carbon tax ballot measure passes. If it does, it will be the nation's first state carbon tax. Do you think that's something we should consider here?
We should all consider it, because the carbon tax, or carbon pricing, as we really should think of it, is a way for us to conveniently and responsibly recognize that the cost of energy is far greater, usually, than the retail price that we pay. To buy ourselves a gallon of gasoline is $3 or $4. Stanford, Rocky Mountain Institute calculated that the cost of a gallon of gasoline to us and to future generations is probably about $200 a gallon. Now, if that was the retail price, if we internalized all those external costs, everything from wars and climate change to pollution, we wouldn't be driving what we're driving. So it's a way of internalizing into the retail prices that we pay an incentive to do the right thing. And we know the right thing is to put less CO2 into the atmosphere. So every time you and I burn a gallon of fossil fuel, whether it's gasoline or jet fuel or outboard fuel, we put 20 pounds of CO2 into the atmosphere. So directly taxing carbon, pricing carbon, and then extracting a tax from us reminds us right there at the pump, at the marketplace, that fossil fuel really costs more than we're paying for it. And then in the case of Washington, as you suggested, if they give us the money back, so it's really a revenue neutral system. And especially if we give some extra back to the poorest among us, then it's a system that does well as it has in British Columbia, Canada. It's a great incentive. We all want to do the right thing, but we need a little help to do that sometimes.
And revenue neutral, like you were saying, means a credit comes back. Just some quick notes I have. A 1% point reduction, this is in Washington State, a 1% point reduction in the state sales tax. This says saving hundreds of dollars per year. Funding the working families tax rebate to provide up to $1,500 a year for over 400,000 low-income households. So when we're talking about that revenue neutral, that's what we're talking about, right?
That's right. So that nobody feels net pain from having done this. It's a little more painful at the pump when we buy our gasoline, but that's what we want. We want that reminder to cause us to buy the electric car that we've been procrastinating about. but then we get the money back, so that the net burden on us is zero, revenue neutral.
And where else have we seen this?
The state of California does not have a formal de facto carbon tax. They do not tax CO2 emissions. But ever since AB 32 and AB 8 and a whole bunch of other laws that they've implemented in California, they have a de facto disincentive for people to continue using fossil fuels. And their revenue from AB 32 programs is $2.2 billion this year, which allows them to build hydrogen fueling stations, 20 of them in the state, 10 in LA, 10 in the San Francisco Bay area. Allows them to fund research programs for new kinds of energy technology, a whole bunch of things to green their economy, so that by the year 2050, if they succeed in both their renewable portfolio standard and in their 80 and 50, the transportation goal, they will be amazingly free of CO2 emissions. But we've also seen that, as you said, Washington is about to vote, and it will be the first state to explicitly have that. Oregon may not be far behind, but in BC, Canada, that's the first political jurisdiction in North America to have an explicit CO2 tax. It started at $10 a ton, CO2, in 2008 and ratcheted up by $10 a ton until it's up to $50 a ton now. So what is that effect on a gallon of gasoline? Well, a ton is 2,000 pounds, and 20 pounds per gallon of CO2 is 1%, so just divide by 100. $50 a ton divided by 100, 50 cents per gallon of gasoline, boat fuel, jet fuel, whatever you're buying, is the carbon tax. That's the disincentive to you to buy and use and burn more fossil fuel.
And we're talking about big corporations and having a carbon tax. Do you think that lets them off too easily?
No, and they have asked for the help too. A carbon tax is something that we have to agree upon individually and collectively at the state or the national, the international level. 6 CEOs of the largest oil companies in the world, including Shell, signed a letter on June 1st to the Frenchman who was the secretary, he was the presiding officer at COP21 in Paris in June of 2015, and to the head of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, saying, please give us a global CO2 emissions carbon tax so that we can build that into our planning and we can start investing in less CO2 emitting technologies. But without that, there's no level playing field. We need that incentive at the corporate level, at the global level.
And I'm thinking in Washington State, there have been some critics on the environmental side that have said, you know, when it comes to this carbon tax, it is revenue neutral, but it's not funding any existing renewable energy infrastructure.
Right.
Do you think that should be part of it?
Well, then it's not revenue neutral. If you don't put that money back where it came from, it's no longer revenue neutral. And the argument there is we don't want it to be revenue neutral. Maybe to help the poorest among us, they have to buy gasoline and they have the least mileage capable vehicles. We want to invest some of that in new technology, either the R&D or the deployment of it, so that we can more quickly decarbonize our energy, total energy industry, not just electricity. We need to speed up the game. The rate at which we are decarbonizing our global energy system is not fast enough.
And I received an email today that kind of told me about some initiatives in California. There's the Global Warming Solution Act in California. It's been around, I think, since 2006.
Yep, that's AB 32.
Right, and our North Slope producers who have oil refineries down there pay what's called a pollution permit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they say they've generated over $2 billion in 2015 by pricing the carbon in oil, gas, and coal. And that's money that goes to Cali's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Energy Fund.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about, that
Yeah.
$2 billion that California generates. Now, JWAC had a very interesting speaker here, Owen Madden, back on September 25th of 2015, and that's still online. You all should go look at Mr. Madden's presentation to Juneau World Affairs Council, because he's talking about the possibility of a carbon tax in the state of Alaska, by the state of Alaska, And here we are, an oil and gas producing state. How could we do that? That would be very unpopular. But it would allow us to raise some revenue without damaging that oil and gas industry, perhaps, which would really help us in our fiscal situation now. Alberta is probably the Canadian province that's most like Alaska. It's their hydrocarbon breadbasket, and they're considering a carbon tax. So there's something here that we should be paying attention to as a state. So see Mr. Madden's presentation on September 25th of last year, I think.
And there might be some
At
critics,
360.
some critics too in the oil and gas industry who say price of oil is so low and now we have to pay this carbon tax too.
Yep.
Do you think there's like some type of middle ground? There's some type of solution there?
We're all in the same boat, and they know that. We cannot continue drilling holes in one end of the boat or the other because the whole thing is sinking. And the headquarters of Shell, for example, is in The Hague, which is below sea level. And it's getting more and more below sea level. We have to work together, the largest and the smallest among us, to stop putting 16 billion tons per year of CO2 in the atmosphere just from human activity burning miscellaneous fossil fuels. We've got to pick up the pace.
And I'd like to open up some questions for all of us to talk about. And this is some big picture stuff about how we can reduce carbon emissions, invest in renewable energy, all while there's such a huge state budget crunch. So like Jody and I were talking about earlier, the state's Renewable Energy Fund couldn't pay for any energy projects this year. In the past, it's helped make up for the cost of big and small scale projects. Jody, you mentioned that this is a fund that could have helped some of that piece of the puzzle you need for the Cake Hydro project. How can we continue investing in renewable energy projects in the age of budget cuts?
Well, there's no silver bullet for sure. I had really hoped that we'd get some federal dollars into that program to help out, especially if you guys are going to be implementing this tax. My people will really be hurt by that. But if some of that money comes back to help us build our next project, then no harm done. Be happy for that.
So like the California model we were talking about, where they take that money from refineries, which is a permit, and then it goes back to invest in renewable energy infrastructure, something along those lines.
Yeah, that's been talked about before, I think, some kind of a surcharge for utilities to collect. But I'm not a lawmaker, but I can see how that would help.
And what do you think? In the age of budget cuts, how can we fund more projects like this?
Washington designed its carbon tax in a particular way that best suited that state. If we considered the same thing, we could construct it in a revenue neutral way if we wanted that best suits our situation. To literally fund the power cost equalization project, although that does not give people an incentive to convert from fossil fuel to non-CO2 emitting energy sources. It allows them to continue doing the same thing they always have, buying diesel fuel at a very high price by the time it arrives at the community. But there is constant progress being made technologically by the renewable energy people. If we could only access deep geothermal heat, if we could bore a hole in Hoonah 6 kilometers down there and access that deep geothermal heat that's there everywhere on Earth, China, Iowa, Hoonah, everywhere, that might be as close as we're going to get to a silver bullet. Electricity might still cost 20 cents a kilowatt hour, but maybe we could get it down to 15, but at least it's base load and you have heat for a district heating system running on this hot water coming out of the ground. So people are working on ways of boring a hole deep into the earth at lower cost without using a monster drill rig in there, bringing in something smaller to do that. So we're making technical progress that eventually will help us, I think. If we can synthesize ammonia and bore a hole in Hoonah, maybe that'll do it.
And Jim, I know that for Juneau Hydropower, they've been looking at some pretty creative funding options like Danish bonds and things like that, right?
Right.
And you went to Denmark, you got to kind of see that. And is the Danish government interested in what's going on in Alaska? Are they interested in maybe funding some of these projects?
Oh, very much, very much. For two reasons. Number one is their district heating systems become more mature and developed. They have all this technical expertise and all the manufacturing expertise in these systems, and so they'd like to export that to other people. And that's part of the loan guarantees that they also offer, is to help people build the systems and buy their stuff and use their expertise.
And kind of going back to the carbon tax, some critics of the proposed carbon tax in Washington state have pointed out that it could disproportionately affect low-income people. And even though it's revenue neutral, meaning that the tax comes back as a credit in some way, it still creates this punitive system. Also in villages like we were talking about, sometimes it's just cheaper to power the town with diesel than investing in hydropower. Is there a way that we can reduce carbon emissions and also make clean energy just more affordable?
Yes, efficiency and conservation, and they are not synonymous. Efficiency means technical, mechanical improvements in something as simple as insulating the building so you need less energy, you use less energy. And then conservation is human behavior. It's turning down the thermostat, buying the electric car, not buying that larger snow machine. So those two, plus sources, technically improved renewable source energy, are going to be very important and promising. But conservation and efficiency is our best investment, rather than building new wind machines and PV plants and solar and hydro plants even. Conservation and efficiency, best investments.
Well, I don't 100% agree, because if I look at my utility, I still have to cover my costs.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is, if people are using less and less and less, my rates go up and up and up. And you know, we don't have more people that are buying the power. In fact, we have more consumers now than we did 5-10 years ago, and we're still selling less power, and that's because of conservation.
Yep.
And that's, I mean, that's a good thing. Everybody makes their personal decision about how to spend their money, but what happens is, like I said, on the other end, my rates are going up, and people are not happy about that. One way or another, we have to pay our bills.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
so it's tough. It's
That is
tough.
tough.
There's just no silver bullet answer to any of this. But
the biggest
but I
utility-
I do agree that we're moving in a good direction and with new technologies, and I definitely support that.
And the biggest utility companies in the country are in the same boat. They're losing revenue as well, as people put PV on their roofs and have a battery. As Jim Rogers, the head of Duke Energy, said before he retired, if everybody gets PV and a battery, we're stuck in the backup energy business.
Right,
right. There's no business model that works for that. So that's almost your situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's tough.
It's tough, yeah.
One thing I saw with my clients, for years oil went up about 6% a year for about 20-25 years on the average. And so their budgets are getting squeezed every year by higher energy prices. And it's hard to then invest in efficiency. And so I see this drop in energy prices as a real opportunity to not sit now and say, hey, this is cheap again, but take that savings and start making those investments now, because it won't be cheap forever. And then, you know, you're in a better situation when the prices go back up.
Mm-hmm. See, for us though, what happens is the savings get passed on to the customer.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they're happy about that. Especially the businesses in the small communities,
Exactly.
they don't get power cost equalization, so they really suffer when fuel prices are high and rates are high.
And when you're saying that, Jody, that kind of reminds me of in Sitka, they had the Blue Lake expansion project, which was completed a couple of years ago. And since then, people aren't using as much electricity for different reasons, warming climate, whatnot. And so they're kind of wanting to sell more electricity because it helps them pay off that hydro project, right?
Yes, and yeah, that's a real tough situation. I really feel for them. You know, we have all these new technologies, even LED lighting. But you know, I talk to my colleagues in the utility industry, and everybody throughout the state is realizing lower sales. Everybody, and it's about a 2% clip going down, down, down. And you know, I mean, it's great that we're conserving, but somewhere I think we end up where we started. You know, with lower rates, I mean, higher rates and lower consumption. Mm-hmm. But that's good in the long run if we're burning less hydrocarbons, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just that it's going to be more expensive.
Well, one other side of the coin, if you decided to build a hydro plant, for example, that had more capacity than you needed, what would you do with that water that's otherwise spilling over the dam? And we sometimes have that at ALP here, I think, and maybe we will with Sweetheart Lake too. If we only had a way of converting that to some sort of transportable energy that we could sell someplace, we could sell to a small community that didn't want to run its diesels, or sell it to Japan. And that's one of the things that the Japanese are working on, that we may be able to cooperate with them. Exporting renewable source energy as hydrogen-rich liquids by the tanker load to Japan.
And kind of building on that idea, are there any new technologies you're really excited about when it comes to renewable energy? Anything that you kind of see as the future?
Well, IPEC looked into a geothermal project at the head of Teneke Inlet. And we were very excited about that because there was 5 or 6 megawatts of power available. That was the estimate of the amount of power that was there. But there was going to be nothing easy about developing that project, and there was a lot of opposition as well. But the estimated cost of the project just for the powerhouse was about $26 million, as I recall. And then you add a transmission line to Hoonah, and there's another $18 million. We ended up with about $46 million, from what I recall, and that's a pretty hard sell. Even if it was to serve the entire Chichagof Island, it'd be difficult to pay for that. So people don't like it when you raise their rates, when you build a project that, I mean, just like in Sitka, that's, I think there's a lot of people over there that aren't very happy about the raising the dam and the cost of it.
So there are technologies there, but it sounds like, just kind of talking to everyone, the problem is sometimes that those technologies can still be really expensive to adapt.
We need more people in Hoonah.
And any other technologies you're excited about?
I think heat pump technology is something I'm really excited about. I feel one of the things that we've done, especially in Juneau, when oil went so high, electricity became cheaper and people just plugged in heaters. And we don't make efficient use of our hydroelectric resources just plugging in a heater, as opposed to a heat pump that can convert that electricity and get 2 or 3 times the amount of heat out of it by using a heat pump. And the heat pump technology is becoming better in cold climates, which was always a limiting factor for it. And it's also becoming more and more efficient and less expensive, so that it really helps us to make viable use of our hydroelectric resources. And if we converted all of our electric heat to heat pumps, maybe as Bill says, now we've got surplus hydroelectric power that we can now convert to other movable energy sources and get them make use of it rather than spill it over the dam.
And those work pretty well in mild climates, so like Southeast Alaska, right?
Right.
And we have some time for questions if anyone has them in the audience. There's a mic back there. And if not, I thank you guys for joining us. We're about out of time. And I'd like to thank my guests, Jody Mitchell with Inside Passage Electric Cooperative, Bill Lady, the director of the Lady Foundation, and Jim Rayfeld of Alaska Energy Engineering. Thanks for joining me, and this was a forum at 360.
Funding for Forum at 360 comes from Rainbow Foods of Juneau.